was technically for presenting Solihull to Iceland in 2007.
Okay.
Gjör það svo vel.
Thank
The
you.
floor is yours.
Thank you, Kiartan. I have no idea what you said before that, but never mind. So, I'm Hazel. So, over my talk, I will use some Icelandic names. So, I'll say them, and you will probably have to guess what it is that I've just said. If you've no idea, I'll have another go at it. So, this is the plan for today. I wanted to take a step back as to why it's important that we're all here tonight, about why it leads into why the Solihull Approach started. And I just want to start, you've heard this already. Marga Tomei is here, at the front here. And you invited me in 2007, where I met some fantastic people. And that was my second time in Iceland, but I love Iceland, I love Reykjavik. And I think you're all very lucky to live here, even when the weather's very terrible. And then last year, Kiartan, Idis, Gunnlaug and Anna Maria all came over to England to have a look at what we were doing in Solihull. And that's an in-between. Kath came from Lancashire. So there's been toing and froing between the UK and Iceland for a few years, and now I'm lucky enough to be here. So why work with families early? Why would you even think of working with families early? Well, as you probably know, because you're here tonight, most trauma, neglect and abuse happens within the family. So therefore it seems a good idea to start with the family and start early. This is some research from the UK, but it's replicated everywhere else, that family conflict is the largest factor causing unhappiness in children. So family conflict is the biggest thing that causes unhappiness in children. And on the other hand, most happiness in children comes from the family. Even when babies become teenagers and they're off with their friends, they still think that you're really important. So we have the two things, the most conflict and the most happiness. So again, it makes sense to work with the family. And another reason is, which you all know, most of our brain, the foundation for our brain development happens before we're 3 years old. Before we're 3 years old. And yet, most countries are intervening much, much later when the symptoms are already there, illness is already there, instead of starting at the beginning when the foundation is being set. And this second point is that the brain develops within the context of relationships. So the relationship with the parent is the most important thing for the future development of that child. I know I'm speaking something that's very simple, but it's amazing how that isn't sometimes understood, that it's within a relationship. Another reason why we should intervene early is this, the ACEs research. So you've heard ACEs, I'm sure many of you know ACEs, but I just want to just go through it a little bit, because this was the research that came out in 1998, a long time ago, by Kaiser Permanente, which was a big hospital group in America, who took all the people who were coming through their doors for a checkup, so we're talking 12,000 people, and they had the idea to see what effect would adverse childhood experiences have on later disease. So most people in 1998 weren't really thinking like that. They were thinking maybe on mental health, mental illness, but what impact would it have on liver disease, heart disease, things that you would not maybe associate with adverse experiences in childhood? And these were the things they asked about: physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, physical neglect, emotional neglect, mother treated violently, household substance abuse, household mental illness, parental separation, and incarcerated. That's one of the parents was in prison. So that's what they were looking at, and what they found was that ACEs are strongly related to the development of mental health. Yes, maybe that wasn't a surprise, but physical health, that was maybe more of a surprise. And the other thing is, it's across the lifespan, so that what happens in our childhoods doesn't just affect us in our childhoods, it can go across the lifespan. And that the more ACEs, the higher the risk. Now, I do want to say that this is a risk. So somebody who has 4 or more ACEs has a much higher risk of smoking, alcohol abuse, drug abuse, and attempting suicide. But these are only risk factors. So lots of people have 4 ACEs, 4 adverse childhood and experiences, and they wouldn't have that. But there is a higher probability of somebody, having that. And then there's the physical health. So there are many papers now, and many more being published all the time, about the physical effects. So increased risk of heart disease, stroke, diabetes, and other things all the time. So again, why not intervene early if we can save all this later on, all this, not just heartache, but also money? It makes sense to invest earlier than it does later. In the UK, we have a phrase called shutting the door after the horse has bolted, which I don't know if you have something like that, but it means you're doing something very late, whereas it would have been very helpful if you'd done it earlier. And again, I'm coming back to the relationship. Why are those ACEs, why are they a risk factor? They sound horrible. Abuse is horrible. Somebody being in prison, having a parent who's struggling with abuse, they're all horrible things. But why do they have an impact on the child? It's not just that they see their mother struggling with alcohol. That's not the thing that makes a difference. Or having a parent in prison, that thing in itself isn't going to make a big difference. What makes a difference is it affects the relationship. So you remember that about happiness in children and unhappiness in children happens within a relationship. And ACEs have an impact on all of us because it affects the relationship. So again, that makes sense then to work with the relationship very early, preferably even before the child is born, to have that impact. But that research was published in 1998. And in terms of impact on governments, in the UK, I would say we are struggling. Now, you must be doing better, because you weren't in the 2007 UNICEF Happiness. They looked at 21 developed countries. You weren't in it because they said they didn't have enough data for Iceland, but the UK was in it. And out of 21, the UK and the USA were at the bottom. At the top was the Netherlands. Now, when they repeated that in 2013, they did have enough data from Iceland, and you came third, which is excellent. The Netherlands still took the top spot. Generally, it's all the Nordic countries at the top, and the UK was a bit better. We'd gone to about 16th. So I don't know why I'm speaking to you when your children are happier than the children in the UK, but anyway, that's why the Solihull Approach started. So UNICEF in 2013 sponsored this book, The Handbook of Early Child Development Research and its Impact on Global Policy. That is, across the world, in countries where it makes sense to spend less early on, most countries are not doing that. And that's why they published this book. That the evidence is now massive. They pulled all the evidence together in that one book because of, to try and increase the impact. It's an uphill. I mean, you're all here today because you have an interest in it. But across the world, it's an uphill struggle. I'm not going to do that yet. So, systems can help, but often they don't. So sometimes things are there that could help this, that could help starting at the beginning and improving things very early on. But often, unless you're thinking about it and you can see the opportunity, sometimes those opportunities are being missed. So I'm going to take the UK as an example. And at the moment, midwives generally don't use their contacts to promote the relationship. They will use their contacts to promote a safe birth, which is very, very important. But at the same time, they could be promoting the relationship. And generally in the UK, they don't. They do skin to skin, which does promote the relationship after the birth. But to take a holistic view across of promoting the relationship, that's not happening. Now, in Northern Ireland, they're now doing this is an advertisement now, they're now doing the Solihull Approach antenatal group across Northern Ireland. And what we've done in the antenatal group, I don't know what your antenatal groups are like, but in the UK they're all about the signs of labour, birth, pain relief, all things you need to know about when you're having a baby. But it's also an opportunity to start thinking about the relationship with the unborn baby, both for the mother and the father and the grandparents and any brothers and sisters. And Northern Ireland have put this across the whole population, so anybody about to have a baby now does a relationship-based antenatal course that brings together relationship building with the stuff you need to know. Normally we do it in 5 sessions, they wanted a 6th session. And out of that, you probably don't have a problem in Iceland with promoting breastfeeding, I don't know, but it's a big topic in the UK because breastfeeding's really low, even though all the evidence shows that breastfeeding is going to be, if you can do breastfeeding, it's going to have better outcomes for the baby. Now, what happened in Northern Ireland, they did the relationship-based course and breastfeeding shot up because people understood why they might want to breastfeed their baby. And often if you give people the knowledge and the understanding, they will then take it forward without you saying, you must breastfeed or you must stop smoking. If you develop the relationship with the baby beforehand, you maybe don't want to poison your baby with smoke or alcohol without somebody telling you not to do it. So the Solihull Approach doesn't tell people what to do. It tries to give an understanding around relationships. So I've already spoken a lot about why early prevention and early intervention is important for all societies. But there's something else as well. So we've said about relationships, but there's also our genetics that contribute. And then the relationship between the environment and our DNA. And here we're in a DNA building, aren't we? Yes. Yes, we're in a genetics building, so this fits very well. So epigenetics, I don't know, it's probably a completely different word in Icelandic, but epigenetics is about the interaction between what we're born with, our DNA, and how the environment affects the expression of that DNA. So the DNA doesn't change, it's the expression of the DNA. So the simplest example I can think of is between worker bees and a queen bee. So the queen bee has exactly the same DNA as a worker bee. You're probably thinking, why is she talking about this? But hopefully it'll get a bit clearer. And how the queen bee turns from a worker bee is she eats royal jelly, which was in a lot of beauty products, but now has been taken over with, whatever else. And here in Iceland, of course, you've got all your Blue Lagoon things. But anyway, never mind. So, royal jelly silences a particular bit of a DNA strand. Well, how's that relevant to us? Well, do you have dandelions? Yeah? Okay, dandelions, that little yellow thing. And in the UK, it can thrive anywhere. It doesn't matter where you put it, it'll grow. And gardeners don't really like it because it grows everywhere. And then an orchid, you need to look after it very properly or it'll die. So we have this side, and then you have to make a value judgment, which you'll need to go along with me, that orchids are more beautiful than dandelions. Now you may disagree, but I just want you to keep that in mind, that orchids can be very special, dandelions are dandelions. So, and what happens is that some children are orchids and some children are dandelions, and that this is a specific gene segment that will make children more responsive, more affected by their environment. So all of you here who've worked with children and families, have cases, you will know children who are in terrible circumstances or siblings who are in terrible circumstances where one child has sort of managed and the other child has not managed at all. And that's the idea of orchids and dandelions. But the other side of that is that some of those children in a good environment will just blossom like an orchid. So some children are very, very sensitive to their environment. You probably you'll be able to think of that yourself. Some children are really, really sensitive to their environment, and some children aren't as sensitive, but they still need a reasonable environment. And the other thing about epigenetics is that there is some evidence that the stuff that happens to us that affects the expression of our DNA can be passed to the next generation. So for smoking, if a mother smokes and there are changes in the unborn baby, that potentially affects the unborn baby and then the baby's children and possibly the next generation. So all I'm making the case for is that that is another reason why intervening early makes so much sense, to shift resources to the front in the early times so that people don't go through so much misery, and so that it isn't passed down the generation. So if you look up epigenetics, the University of Utah, UTAH in Utah in the States, they do a fantastic website about epigenetics. And you can see there the rat studies, but there's also been studies on Holocaust survivors and also those who went through famine in Poland and different places to see how the effect can actually be encoded. So, relationships. They contribute to resilience, they contribute to recovery, and they help shape the contribution of our genome to our lives. So, where should we intervene? The relationship. When should we intervene? As early as possible. And the Solihull Approach, strangely, is all about relationships. It didn't start in that place, but it rapidly ended up in that place. And it's more about it's not a skills training. Can you see this over here? Shall I move over here for a little bit? Oh, dear me. Maybe I'll go back. So, the Solihull Approach isn't a skills training. It's a shift in understanding. And we have day 1 and day 2 happens 2 weeks later because something happens in people's minds as they process it to shift their understanding, and that's what we're about. So how did we start? Well, we started about the same time as the ACEs research in 1998, maybe a little bit earlier. And what happened was that I work in child and adolescent mental health services. So I'm a psychologist and a psychotherapist. And I quickly learned that we were extremely well trained, but we only saw the tip of the iceberg of the people coming through. The people in the UK who see everybody are the public health nurses, or in England, the health visitors. They see everybody. So, if you're going to make an impact on a population, it's nice to have highly trained people, but you're going to make an impact by raising the average of the workers who are in contact with everybody. So it just happened that health visitors asked me, is there something you can do? We're working with these families, they're coming to see us, and in the UK, a lot of people are trained in behavioural techniques. So they can roll out a behavioural program in like 5 minutes because they've been trained in it and they know what they're doing. However, the complaint was that the mothers or the fathers were coming back and the health visitor had designed a beautiful program, but the person hadn't done any of it. It was having no effect. They hadn't done any of it. Which, as a psychologist, when I did behavioural programs, I remember having the very same experience. So, when we listened closely to what was going on, it seemed that the parents who were coming to clinic with difficulties had no headspace. No headspace. Their heads were full of worries, anxieties. They had no space to think about the children, and that's the diagram that you saw, which I might whiz through later on containment. But there wasn't any headspace there to think. And let me just go. So there at the top there is containment. So what we did first was containment comes from psychoanalysis. And in psychoanalysis, it's a very, very important concept. But it had stayed hidden in psychoanalysis, and they'd kept it all to themselves. They kept it all to themselves, and they weren't sharing it. But it's a very useful concept. It was developed in the UK by Bion in about 1956 was when he first wrote about it. It's a really useful concept. And why is it a useful concept? Because it's about how we process emotions to restore the ability to think. To restore the ability to think. And that's the pictures that you saw that were like this. Full head, no headspace, no room to think. But there's a way of maybe unplugging that, of helping someone to think. Now, you have a lot of sagas, and I've probably mispronounced that name even before I start talking about them, but never mind. And you have one rather long saga called Egil. Egil's saga. Okay, and I presume you all know the saga, but Egil, when he was very young, a very young boy, he was described as impetuous and very quick-tempered. And the young boys that he played with quickly learned that they had to let him win, that he was really impetuous. And the other thing about him was towards the end of his, I'll bring that together in a minute, you'll just have to just keep that in mind. Towards the end of his life, one of his sons called, I'm just going to go for it, Gunnar, all right, died. And then his other son, Bodvar, went to fetch a load of logs, and his ship sank and he died. And Egil was so overcome by grief that he took to his bed, and he wanted to die himself. He was just overcome. He couldn't think of anything else. He just wanted to die, which meant he wasn't thinking about his family or anything else. He was not functioning. So his head was absolutely full. And what his wife did, and I think his wife's called Asgard. Yes, that's it. Invited his daughter, Thorgard, yeah, that's it, over to come and talk to him. And what she did was come in, and she didn't argue with him, didn't try and drag him out of bed and his bedroom. She went with him in that room and went where he was. But what she did was get him to start putting it into words. So then he wrote that long poem, all about his grief. So he started off with the grief of his son, and by the end of it, he also talked about the loss of his mother and his father. And after that, in the story, it says, Egil began to recover his spirits as he proceeded to compose the poem, i.e. he was putting his feelings into words, he was starting to process them, left his bed and sat down in the high seat and held a funeral feast. And that, I would say, is a really nice example of containment, because containment restores the ability to think. And there is, there's loads of research about it. So in a parental way, it helps the parents to think about the children. It helps the parent process old emotions so that they can see the child. So, for example, one of the cases I had when we were pulling this model together was I had a referral for a little 4-year-old boy saying he did this and he did that and he did the other. And of course, when he came to me with his mother, he looked delightful, a lovely red-haired little boy. And then in the story, it came out that the red hair reminded her of when she'd been raped by somebody with red hair. Now, it only took that one session for that because the mother realised that she was putting some old emotion onto her son where it didn't belong, and it just lifted. And that was the shift in that mother. And this is I won't spend a lot of time on this, but this is the performance anxiety curve. This was 1951. There's been masses of research since then that as our anxiety and our arousal level goes up, or like Ehil, he was so full of emotions that he could not do anything. This is exactly what happens with actors, actresses, sports people, us. You know, we need some anxiety or some arousal level, but if it gets too much, we'll be pretty hopeless. And what happens in a relationship with a public health nurse or a psychologist or one of you is that you bring this back round and restore the ability to think. So this is very simple, but it's also very profound. And it just speaks to us as human beings. This is how we are. We're not different. So, you know, this is just how we are, and understanding that can make a big difference. Now, reciprocity. You've got some terribly long and difficult words in Icelandic. So normally to a UK audience, I have to apologise that reciprocity is a difficult word, but I feel that you've got much more difficult words than that, so I don't need to. But reciprocity comes from Brazelton in the United States in the 1970s. So this research was published. At the time, scientists seemed to think that babies were a lump of something that didn't do much. He videoed mums and babies, and he found that there was a pattern to the interaction. So I'm just going to try something with you now. It might work, it might not, I don't know, but let's give it a go. I want all of you to think of a nursery rhyme. Do you know, is that the same like in Icelandic? You know, a song, the song that you'd sing to a baby, your favourite nursery rhyme that you'd speak to a baby or a 1-year-old. So I want you to think of what that song is. And now the hard part, I don't want you to be shy, because I want you to pretend that that baby's in front of you. And when I count down 1, 2, 3, I want you all to start at once to speak out loud. You can speak very quietly if you want, or you can just, just give it some go. Say that rhyme. The reason why I'm asking you to speak out loud, which you might feel a bit shy about, is because if you say it in your head, you'll say it a lot quicker. And I need to test something out. So you just need to say it out and just don't bother with what anybody else is doing. Okay? Are we good to go? So I'll count down, and then all of you start saying out loud, as though you were doing it with a little child, your nursery rhyme in Icelandic. So I won't understand any of it, but never mind. Okay. 1, 2, 3. Just one verse will do. Well, see, normally when I do this across cultures, it would take maybe 20 seconds for somebody to say that. Yours was definitely longer, which is very interesting, but still in the right ballpark. I think you were creeping up to 25 seconds, maybe a little bit longer. Because what Brazelton found was that there's a pattern of interaction between babies and mothers that lasts around 20 seconds. It starts, it goes up, and it comes down again. So in most cultures, it seems to me, the nursery rhymes, the little things you sing to your children, have developed within that space. Now, it may be we'd have to do this under different conditions, or it means that your babies have a longer attention span than other babies. But why it's important is because it says three things. One is that babies are as active in a social interaction as the adult. They are as active. They come out of the womb sophisticated. They are ready to interact with you, unless they've got difficulties. They are ready to interact. The next thing is that there's a pattern, and at the end of it, the baby will look away. They may do this, which is a big look away. They may just shut their eyes. They may just look down, but the baby will look away. Now, if you can explain that to a mother who has low self-esteem, or who's a bit paranoid, or who thinks her baby doesn't like her, that will turn that relationship around. Because otherwise, that mother, when the baby looks like that, they'll come in and try and get the baby to interact with them and keep interacting with them. But that's no good, because the third thing is, when the baby looks away, for the microphones here, when the baby looks away, that's when the neurons in the brain are joining up after that experience, which makes sense. They've taken it in, and now things are joining up in the brain. So if the mother or the father is swooping in to stop that happening, then the baby isn't going to process, which means the baby isn't going to have as many neurons as it should have by the end of it. And that is such a simple thing to explain to parents, but it makes an enormous difference. It also makes a difference for teenagers. So in the UK, teachers will often say, "Look at me while I'm talking to you." I don't know if that ever happens in Iceland, but it happens a lot in the UK. Now, if you can explain to teachers that actually a lot of children, if you're giving them instructions, they will need to look away. In fact, you probably do. So I find sometimes I'll look up to the left, and sometimes my colleagues, I can see them, they'll look, they go, see what I'm looking at, but I'm giving myself, I just automatically do it. It's how I give myself some thinking time. And why am I doing that? Because if I look to the up, generally up, I'm cutting down on the stimulation coming in to me while my brain concentrates. And you will have your own way of doing it. I don't know, you might shut your eyes, you might do something else, but you might, whatever you do, you will have a way of controlling the stimulation coming into your brain while your brain's trying to make sense of something. Right, so that's the rhythm. That's what, in any other culture I've tried this with, takes about 20 seconds, but with you may take a little bit longer. But you're still in the right ballpark, and there's still this pattern to the interaction. And reciprocity, I have to say that Ehil obviously didn't get enough. So when he was growing up, let's say that out of his, because he had brothers, didn't he? I don't know if he had sisters. I can't remember if he had sisters. But if a child sort of popped out of the womb and is particularly like this, which I imagine Ehil was, then he needs extra work to help him manage himself. Now, it seems to me, having read how many people he killed, and some of them for the most, to me, ridiculous reasons, that he found it very difficult to control his emotions and what he was doing from a very early age. And he didn't have enough help to manage himself. Now, it seems to me that his wife, Asgard, did a much better job than maybe his parents did with him, because the other brother that he didn't like, his son that he was his least favourite son, and maybe was his least favourite son because he was completely different to Ehil, who was Thorstein, something like that. He, when I seemed to be really very thoughtful man, he was not impulsive at all. He didn't react when at first when his neighbour tried to pinch the land to graze his cattle on. It seemed like, and also the daughter had gone into Ehil and had managed Ehil to get him to process things. So I imagine she must have had more help from Asgard. So it feels to me that that's quite a nice case study for containment and reciprocity within a really well-written, a really very long case study. Also, there was another thing. I think you have a saying in Iceland. I'm going to link this to containment. I think you have a saying in Iceland called, what do you do if you're lost in an Icelandic forest? Is that a saying? And the answer is, you stand up. And it seems to me that that's a quite nice way, especially if somebody helps you stand up, to explain containment. Because containment is restoring the ability to think. Standing up restores your ability to see where the path is and where you're going to plan. So it doesn't quite fit with containment, but I like it. So we've done that. So this is the aim of the Solihull Approach. In other words, to do a lot. But basically, I think, my personal view is if you increase the quality of relationships, you'll do all of that. Although your children are already the third happiest in the developing nation, so you're not doing too badly. How does Solihull Approach do this? We provide training and resources, and they've been developed over 20 years now. We do face-to-face groups of parents, and now in the UK, because we want much bigger coverage, we want dads, fathers to do it, and grandparents. They're now online resources. And some areas in the UK offer it to all of their population. So within an area like Norfolk, or I don't know what, Surrey, there's like big areas where if you're a parent there, you can get the online course. And the other thing, lots of people use it to set up a team. It brings staff together. That's my wish, that every parent should have access to relationship-based antenatal course. That's my first wish, because let's start early. And then my next wish is to a relationship-based parenting course. And in the UK, there's a lot of stigma to accessing parenting stuff, and we're trying to take that stigma away. People think that if they have to access it, even though they want more information, it means they're a bad parent. So we're trying to get rid of that. So that's my conclusion. I think relationships in every sentence. So finally,